Hi everyone, I wanted to give a brief demo of the new partial update mode. So right now we have a simple scene with a fairly stiff looking guy who falls into a box and then down into the floor. And I'll show you how long that takes to simulate in a full update by just hitting the refresh. It's not too bad. In typical scenes when you have a control rig, this can be much slower. And in those cases, what you can do is switch it from full update into partial update. And what partial update does is it stops reading animation data and it just reads the weight shift data. So for example, in partial update, I've used the limb control system to make it easy to set up this character, control him. So I'm just changing the spine and arms from 1 to 0.2. And so now we kind of have a floppy spines and arms, and we can preview those changes. And you'll notice when I click the button that the refresh goes a bit faster. This is already pretty fast, so it's not as noticeable. If you have a heavy scene, it'll be much more noticeable. And you can also limit the amount of processing it does by changing what it has to update. So for example, if I look at the very end of the simulation, I'll get some animation. So right here, at the very end of the simulation here, if I go to a full refresh and I do hit refresh, you'll notice it has to process all the data before this region before it updates the end of the simulation. If I'm just interested in the end of the simulation here, if I go into a partial refresh and I hit refresh, it's just going to simulate the frames that are viewed. So only these frames are being simulated. But I can still come here and I can change, let's say, the leg strength. So if I'm looking at this impact, I want to change the leg strength down to 0.1, make it much weaker. You can do a partial refresh and see what happens with those weaker legs. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that when you're in a partial update, weight shift is not reading any changes to the transform data or any data before the viewed range. So for example, changing the position of the character up here is not influencing the performance down here. But if I change this to a full refresh and now do an update, you'll see that you get a completely different performance. So for example, here, now he's falling and then doing that sort of change. So full update will catch those sort of changes. Whereas if we're doing a partial refresh, notice that it doesn't update the position of any of the animation data. So you have to understand when to use a partial refresh and when to use a full refresh. There are cases, let's say that we do a full refresh now just to get those new transforms. Hopefully it falls off the part down here. Maybe you do want to get some animation data, but just for a limited range. So in this case, if I'm just tweaking this area, I just want to update this area here, but I want to read the animation data, I can switch it into partial refresh, but then change my settings. So now I can say, read the animation transforms, but I'm not reading anything outside of the viewed range. So now I can start moving his leg in this case. So if I want to move his leg up inside the viewed range, I can come up here and see what would happen if we rotated his leg. Oops, not that. Rotated his leg up. So we'll get that animation update from him rotating his leg up, maybe. Maybe we make this one bend back. So it is reading the animation transforms, but now only in this smaller range, so you get a faster update. So use the partial mode if you want to speed up your interaction with weight shift. You have to be careful and kind of understand how it works and switch between full refresh and partial refresh to get the best performance.